Hi, everybody. Welcome to this short online discussion about driving down emissions, which is a new report from Transportation for America and Smart Growth America. It's all about how our land use and transportation decisions are connected together, have a huge impact on climate change. A report that also impacts five strategies that will help us make a dent in the growth of emissions while also helping build great places for everybody to live in. So today we're just going to have a quick run through of what's in the findings. We're going to have Beth Osborne, who's the director of Transportation for America, which is a program of Smart Growth America. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Steve Davis. I'm the director of communications for Smart Growth America and for Transportation for America. Beth is going to walk through the findings, and then we also have Sam Rockwell with us today, who is the executive director of Move Minnesota, which is a group based in the Twin Cities, I believe, that is working at the forefront of all of these issues statewide and locally in cities across the state. And he's going to explain a little bit of what they've discovered in Minnesota the last few years about trying to reduce emissions, reduce emissions through transportation. So we have the chat box open throughout this whole session right now. So if you want to ask any questions, feel free to go ahead and put them in there. We'll have some time at the end. After these two short, Beth and Sam are going to go for 10 or 15 minutes apiece, and we'll save a good bit of time for questions at the end. So get your questions in. We'll tackle some of those. And if you have not seen the report yet, feel free to go to the Smart Growth America website or to the Transportation for America website. Got the URL there on the screen, and you should be able to find them there. So please download, read the report, and get familiar. So without further ado, let's go ahead and kick it off. I'm going to pass it off to Beth Osborne, who's the director of our Transportation for America program, to walk through the findings in here and explain how we can drive down emissions with better land use and transportation decisions together. So take it away, Beth.
Hello, everybody. As Steve said, I'm Beth Osborne. I'm Director of Transportation for America. Transportation for America is a national nonprofit that is focused on a transportation system that connects people to jobs and other essential services, no matter their financial means or physical abilities, and by all modes of travel. We do our work through reports like this and analysis of policies in the existing system. We do direct technical assistance with those trying to address our mission, and we do policy advocacy. So this report comes with very express policy suggestions. We're part of a broader organization called Smart Growth America, which is charged with supporting cities, towns, and neighborhoods that are built in a way that are economically prosperous, socially equitable, and environmentally sustainable. So let's jump into our new report, Driving Down Emissions. This is an outgrowth of conversations that we have had with many policymakers who want to find ways to address the inefficiency of our transportation system, other than just addressing electrification of the transportation system. But we're struggling to find something that was fewer than several hundred pages that could explain ways that they could tackle that. As I'm sure many of you, if not all of you on this call know, transportation is the majority, or not the majority, the largest greenhouse gas emitter in terms of sectors, in recent years passing up the utility sector. And that's because after decades of financial incentives and policies that reoriented almost all community growth around high-speed car travel, it means most people have to drive to do even basic things, even over short distances, and the emissions from those vehicles have skyrocketed. Transportation now accounts for 28% of the share of carbon emissions in the US, and in many states is 40% or the majority. The vast majority of these emissions are from cars and trucks. And I do want to state at the outset, because I fear that this is missing a lot of times when we focus on something other than electrification, but electrifying the transportation fleet is absolutely essential, no less than essential. It is unfortunately not sufficient, but we can't do what we need to do without electrification. We just need to do more than just electrification. We wouldn't attack building efficiency by saying, let's make HVAC systems super efficient, but not worry about the windows. They'll be fine. They can leak as much as we want. But in transportation, we seem to believe this is the only sector where we need a silver bullet. We can put all of our eggs in one basket and be fine. And this report is to point out that is not the case. We need to do both areas. We need to focus on the vehicles. We need to focus on the system. We will never achieve ambitious climate targets or create more livable, equitable communities if we don't make it possible for people to get around outside of a car and provide more housing in places where that's already an option. There are short-term reductions we can make in emissions just by making it possible for people to walk short distances. I am reminded of living in Baton Rouge, Louisiana when I was in college, go Tigers, and next door to my apartment complex was a grocery store. But I could not walk there without having to scale a wall or walk in traffic. So I drove next door. This is the system designed to emit. This is the system that is going to cause us a lot of trouble. So going on to the next slide. This is something we have seen over history where we try to tackle emissions through making the vehicle more efficient, but pushing people to drive more and farther, and it undermines what we're trying to do, especially in the short run. While we're turning over the vehicle fleet, we will find this to be undercut if people just have to drive more. In fact, in the CAFE standard setting regulation, they account for a rebound effect. It became cheaper to drive, so people drive more. And so we need to handle both inputs and again, make it possible for people to move around outside of a vehicle. Moving on to the next slide, you can see here that driving is directly connected to how much we pollute. As driving increases, CO2 increases, and they go in parallel. There's all kinds of things going on underneath it in terms of the efficiency of vehicles and the sort of vehicles people are buying, but you can see that the lines are very much connected. And moving on to the next slide. Something that I fear is lost on a lot of people is that, and I know folks on this call understand, is that the system you have to build for a vehicle, whether it is gas powered or powered by electricity, comes with its own greenhouse gas problems, climate problems, and other environmental problems. And that's why a single-minded focus on the tailpipe is a problem. Again, we should definitely focus on the tailpipe. But if we only focus on the tailpipe, we forget about so many other emitters in our system that is built to accommodate that car and will still have to be built to accommodate electric cars. There's been some research recently showing that just the pavement itself on a hot day, and with climate change we'll have more hot days, is emitting particulate matter. It's possible it's emitting greenhouse gases as well. So we need to think about the whole system and address it together. We need to recognize that the vehicle fleet turnover does not happen overnight. Vehicles are very reliable. People hold on to them a while, and it can take 15 years to turn over. That's why a lot of projections about even robust policies to replace gas cars with electric cars set the date for that to occur very far out in the future and have relatively modest projections in the near term. We can certainly do a lot to speed that up, but we shouldn't wait. We should do things today that allow Beth Osborne living in Baton Rouge to walk next door so that you don't have to emit greenhouse gas emissions just to go next door. And we have research that does show that there, even with all of the most strong objectives to between now and 2030, 2040, we need to get something out of driving as well. So let's talk a little bit about why that is and move on to the next slide. And this is something we spent a lot of time on in the report, is talking about how our system doesn't just encourage more driving, it in some ways makes it hard not to drive more. So a concept we've had a lot of trouble expressing to the general public is induced demand. If we attempt to make it more simple for policymakers to understand, because it goes against the natural belief that if you expand a highway, you reduce congestion. But what happens when you expand a highway that is heavily congested or an arterial roadway that is heavily congested is someone who would have said, there's no way I'm getting on that road right now because I know what I'm going to find there. I know it's going to be stop and go traffic. Maybe I'll put off my trip or take a different route. When you expand it, they say, oh, it's not so bad now. They just expanded it, and they add trips. And then as you add trips, or at the same time, a more open highway encourages people to build further out. In fact, in many cases, there's an example in South Carolina of an arterial that has been planned for expansion, and there's already development occurring at the edge because they know it will be expanded and can accommodate more cars. And by the time it opens, there will already be so many more new housing units, it will overwhelm the expansion they haven't even started to build. So we see this sort of thing all the time. And those developments are made possible by the knowledge that there will be more expansion, there will be more capacity on the roadway. It's not an accident. So we need to recognize that a lot of our policies push people's needs, their homes further away from where they need to go and spread things out. And we need to express this to folks that as we continue to do the same things, we're going to see more driving just because it gets harder and harder to walk or bike. The further things go, and transit is hard when everything is totally spread out and nothing is clustered together. So moving on to the next slide. This is something I mentioned before. This very trend has pushed people, every single person, to drive more than they used to. And it leads to a fate where we're being told we will have to drive more hours and spend more time in our car to be able to accomplish the same things we accomplish today. From a systems engineering or industrial engineering perspective, this is the exact opposite of what you want. You want people to be able to expend less, to use less energy, to be able to do the same things. That's the definition of efficiency. But in our country, we somehow have reversed it. And in many cases, I see folks talking about how the fact that people are driving more and further is a sign of success. That might be a good sign when people are staying home because employment is really, really low, but as a matter of course is a very inefficient take. Moving on. This is our way of expressing why the way we develop our communities predetermines how well transportation will work and how much people have to drive. On the right-hand side, which is what the overwhelming majority of the country faces, not only are various destinations far from your home, they're far from each other, each link requiring a vehicle trip, versus the trip on the left. Even if you don't live close to this area, you can drive in and do everything within a short distance. That might be one trip parked and then just walking around to accomplish everything else. That is at least within the realm of possibilities. If you live close to this area, you might very well do these trips on foot because it's clustered together. The sprawling development makes each trip difficult, and no matter how efficient your vehicle, you're covering a lot of territory in order to accomplish the same things, and it requires a ton of pavement to accommodate you. Again, the pavement itself requires energy to make, to pour, it emits in the heat, and it emits heat into the neighborhoods close by, which is it's a big problem now, will be an even bigger problem with climate change. Moving on to the next slide. At the same time, sprawl costs a lot more. It costs more to people because when you have to drive everywhere, you need more vehicles and you need to spend more on the operation and maintenance of those vehicles. It also costs more to the government because for the same number of people and households, you have to expend much more on roadways and utilities. which are covering far fewer households. So it costs everybody more. And it's not just in terms of roads and sewer lines and water lines, it's in terms of garbage pickup and schools and police and fire and all of those sorts of things. We have an economics team that will review the various costs and expenditures related to different land use design, and the ones that are most efficient and allow people to move around outside a vehicle also are the ones in the black when it comes to cost versus taxes, the cost to serve versus the taxes received. Those areas where you have to drive everywhere cost the government and the taxpayer more to serve than they bring in tax dollars. So there's an economic, there's a government, there's a cost savings benefit of attacking the problem with the system other than just the greenhouse gas benefits of a more walkable, rollable, bikeable, transit served type community. Moving on to the next slide. What happens also with this type of development is we immediately try to make up for the natural inconvenience of putting everything you need far away from where you are by letting you go really fast. I understand that the grocery is unnecessarily far from your home, and I will make that up to you by allowing you to go 55 miles per hour most of the way there. That decision, which is an understandable one because the inconvenience created by the land use decision making, immediately creates a danger for anyone, both in a vehicle, but particularly outside of a vehicle. Speed, and we do design our roads for speed. Again, there are two reasons for that. One is to make up for the inconvenience of everything you need being far away, and the other is because the template we use for transportation is the highway. And we just apply that as a one-size-fits-all design system for every single roadway out of there or around your community, whether it's a highway or an arterial, even a local street, because we assume everyone's going to be in a car, and we assume that they're going to want to get someplace quickly, and we've made distances long. When we focus on speed, though, you see that crashes immediately become more deadly. And we have really seen this during COVID, where during the pandemic, at least the first 6 months of the year where the data are available, we have seen that people are traveling at much higher speeds, the speeds that the design of the roadway encourages, no matter what the speed limit says. And without traffic to slow them down, they're going quite fast in the middle of the day. People are getting into crashes with more frequency, and they're becoming deadly, not just to pedestrians, but to the drivers too. You can see how quickly the danger grows from just 20 to 30 miles per hour and 30 to 40 miles per hour, a speed we see on a good portion of arterials around the country is an extraordinary leap as well. This is something that, those early decisions we made in terms of land use and in terms of priority on the roadway, this is one of the things that it leads to. And if we make a different decision with our land use and our roadways that can benefit greenhouse gas emissions by reducing the need to travel, we also can fix this along with it. Now, this incidence of deadliness in our roadways impacts people of color to a much greater extreme because people of color are much less likely to own a vehicle. It is also in neighborhoods of color that you see some of our fastest arterials, sometimes highways, because maybe we didn't put the attention to the impacts on the neighborhood and unfortunately throughout our history, particularly on neighborhoods of color, to ensure that we are equally considering the mobility of people who might not be able to get in a car in the first place. So we need to not just look at this as a great opportunity for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but all the co-benefits that go with it, if not the primary benefits of greater equity, greater safety, and cost savings. Moving on to the next slide. This is just a roundup of a lot of the things that we have spoken about. A lot of the problems we have in our transportation system are based in regulations that create these problems, that force housing further away from all of your necessities. We can remove regulations and create a more equitable, and clean and climate-friendly community. It's not about regulating our way there. This is one sector where the regulations are sending us in the wrong directions. Regulations based in health decisions made to address the health issues of the early 20th century. It's time to update that and allow development to be clustered, allow people to be able to get to the things they need on a regular basis, like groceries and banks and schools and medical care, without having to drive, especially when those things are located close to us. Already, make the street design match up with it. Make safety the priority of street design, not speed of vehicles. We have to weigh all travelers' needs in the system, and we have to make sure that the overall goals of climate change, equity, efficiency, cost savings are embedded in those decisions as well. We should institute greenhouse gas reduction and less driving as a goal of the transportation system. There was an attempt to have state departments of transportation and metropolitan planning organizations set targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as part of their transportation plans. That was repealed by the current administration, but whether or not the feds require it, there's nothing prohibiting states from doing it, and yet there are very few states that are. These are very simple things to do that could be done by executive order in most places, and quite frankly, it's hard to believe that someone prioritizes climate change improvements in transportation if they're not even measuring the impacts of their system on the thing they claim to be a priority. We can invest heavily in non-car options for getting around. We spent the last 70 years going in fully on car infrastructure. To get close to even, you would have to spend many decades going in fully on other modes of travel, not just as a subset like transit, which gets 20% of funds while highways get 80% of funds, but really trying to bring transit investment up to a level of highways and designing roadways for people who are walking and biking and catching transit, not just those driving through. And as we're measuring the benefits of transportation and kind of remembering those two graphics that show a sprawling neighborhood, now far everything is, and a more connected neighborhood that has all of your destinations clustered together, we can measure now using GIS how many destinations you can reach by all modes of travel from your home. And we can use that measure to see if the transportation system is really connecting you with the things that you need, rather than focusing on how fast you went along the way there. We should use modern tools to be able to address modern problems. And I think that brings me to the end of my presentation. It does. And I am going to introduce Sam Rockwell, or hand things over to him. He is our partner in Minnesota. I do want to, before I hand things over, just officially thank the McKnight Foundation for funding this work. They've been a great partner to Transportation for America and Move Minnesota for many, many years, and their commitment to climate and equity has been extraordinary and empowering to us to really focus on this. So Sam is going to talk about these very issues, but while focusing in on what's going on in Minnesota. Sam, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Beth. Yes, we've been thrilled to partner with Transportation for America here at McKnight Foundation. The Driving Down Emissions report is set up as a primary report and then a case study of Minnesota. So I'll cover a number of the same themes here that Beth did with kind of Minnesota-specific data and facts, and then talk a little bit about how Minnesota has made some movements in the right direction and where they may need to go in order to actually hit their existing climate targets and targets that we know are needed more broadly. So we can go to the next slide. Minnesota is pretty similar actually to the United States broadly in its transportation emissions in terms of percentage of total emissions. It's the highest emitting sector in the state, and as Beth noted, in the nation as a whole, transportation is increasing in its percentage share, largely because other emission sources are going down, right? So in Minnesota, We've got some strong leadership in some of our utilities with targets for net zero emissions for their full portfolio, from Excel to Evergreen Energy, smaller utilities. And we've seen since 2001 a drop in coal from 66% of the portfolio to 31% of the portfolio. So as energy and the electric sector goes down, we've seen transportations, as we'll see a little bit later in this presentation, have stayed largely static. So there's a fair amount of work to do. We can go to the next slide. Folks in Minnesota understand that there's a lot of work to do, and so there have been a number of studies and targets set specifically for transportation. What we're seeing here is from the state MnDOT, Minnesota Department of Transportation, MnDOT's Pathways report, which is a report on how we get to a more sustainable transportation sector. You know, as we think about the kind of community benefits and the community and land use transformations that Beth covered, we don't see a lot of that here in the Pathways report. You can see the little red bar close to the top. That is MnDOT's plan for reducing vehicle miles traveled, and just reducing vehicle miles traveled in the urban areas. And there's a heavy reliance on biofuels here and other technologies, which, again, we absolutely need electrification of the transportation sector. Biofuels is a political winner in Minnesota, given our strong agricultural sector. You probably saw that on our last slide as well. But here we've got a reliance on technologies that don't exist yet. And as we saw in Beth's presentation, we'll see here, we know how to make progress with our land use and transportation designs. And the cities, the center cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, the largest cities in the state, Twin Cities, they have both done their own analyses of how to reach their own climate targets. They've got climate targets of 80% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 in Minneapolis and 100% in St. Paul. Minneapolis determined, even with electric vehicle adoption and strong assumptions on how many electric vehicles are actually on the road in 2050, they need to reduce their vehicle miles traveled by 38%. In St. Paul, they've analyzed similarly and found they need to reduce 50% vehicle miles traveled by 50%. So we've seen in some of the in our center cities that the analysis is showing we really do need strong VMT targets. The state does not have any VMT targets right now, but has acknowledged that they need to start to amp up their game, and we've actually seen some signals of progress in that direction. There's a climate sub-cabinet in the governor's office and a sustainable transportation advisory committee with a VMT reduction subgroup, which has not yet come out with any recommendations, but it is a group that's been pulled together. And then just last night, there was the Minnesota State House released a climate action plan with a transportation focus, one of the 4 focuses, and they had 3 recommendations for the transportation sectors. One is electrifying the vehicle fleet, which we know we need to do. 2 is building out transit connections and investing in transit. And the third, and this is quoting the policy, is change transportation and land use planning to reduce the need to drive. So that's a really big step in the right direction in what we know we need to do. So that's an encouraging development. We can move to the next slide. We're going to need to dig in deep in Minnesota because we have a lot of sunk costs and a lot of investments in the transportation system that we have, the car-based transportation system that we have. Minnesota ranks 5th in the nation in terms of total road miles, even though it's just 12th in terms of geographic size and 22nd in terms of its population. So really disproportionate investment in roads. And we also have are unfortunately high up in purposes of gas guzzlers. So there is a fair amount of work to do, and understanding kind of how to move through that means understanding a little bit more about where we are. If we can go to the next slide. Our vehicle miles traveled across the state, which is the top line here, the blue dots, has been going up. However, if we can go to the next slide, we've actually started to turn a corner in the right direction in some important ways. And this is that the per capita VMT has dropped a bit in the last decade, and emissions have also dropped and held steady. So it's not adequate to get to where we need to go, even within the current state emissions reductions goals. The state has missed those goals in recent years, but this shows that we're starting to figure out how to, at least at an individual level, break that VMT growth scenario. And so a closer look really starts to showcase the induced demand that Beth was talking about. We see that that places in the state of Minnesota which have increased vehicle miles traveled are the suburban and exurban areas in the metro for the most part. For the most part, rural areas, greater Minnesota, have held fairly steady. And then in the center cities, again, Minneapolis and St. Paul, first-ring suburbs, we've actually seen a decrease in vehicle miles traveled since the year 2000. So that underscores that those areas of the state which are more sprawling land use patterns are driving VMT up, while the areas where we've been investing in transit and biking and walking, we'll talk a little bit more about those investments in a minute, have actually seen VMT decreases. So it's a proof, a case in point of the important point of reducing those incentives to drive. We can go to the next slide. So the investments that have happened in the center cities are not just in the center cities, but in that core metro area in Minnesota have been fantastic. We've seen light rail developments and bus rapid transit developments driven in part by funding, which is from a county sales tax, and there used to be a sort of multi-county sales tax system, which helped fund many of those lines. While we've seen transit ridership overall fall slightly in recent years, we've seen the ridership on those key lines, those improved lines, go up quite a bit. So, for example, when we've seen bus rapid transit investments, we've seen 30% ridership increases on those lines on each of the bus rapid transit investments that we've seen. So, a real hunger for those investments. We've also seen bike lanes and more walkable sidewalk designs, downtown designs popping up around the state in some of our suburban communities and town communities all around the state. And then here we see a picture of a pretty bold move from Minneapolis and St. Paul jointly to roll out new speed limits for all of the two center cities, dropping that speed limit from 30-mile-an-hour speed limit down to a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit on neighborhood streets, 25-mile-an-hour speed limit on arterials. So, you know, this is again pulling that knowledge from Beth's slideshow and putting it into practice here of trying to drive down the speed limits to make the streets safer, bring fatalities down, and of course create a positive feedback loop of folks using the streets and then becoming more comfortable on the streets, more eyes on the streets, and increasing that use. And then as bike systems have built out and sidewalk expansions have occurred, boulevard expansions, we've seen a much more gradual design shift as well to start to actually narrow lanes, give actual square footage over to other modes of transportation. And we have the start of some dedicated bus lanes as well within the metro area. We can go to the next slide. These investments are, of course, driven by our agencies, but they are really driven by the people of Minnesota. And this is really encouraging. In Minnesota, on the left here, we see survey results from the state transportation plan, the pathways report mentioned earlier, on ways that folks want to see decarbonization happen. You see the top three scorers here are all related to walking, biking, and transit. Whether that's improving public transit, electrifying our transit vehicles, or creating walkable and bikeable communities. And so these are the top things that the voters of Minnesota want, and that provides the political will and the political cover for our elected officials and our agencies to begin to make some significantly amped up investments. And we continue to see this play out on the state level as well. We just received funding for a couple more bus rapid transit lines just a few weeks ago. And then on the more local scale, the word cloud on the right comes from the Minneapolis Transportation Action Plan public engagement. They've been creating a transportation action plan, which is actually still not finished. And the number one word coming out of their public engagement was transit. And of course, the funny thing is that, as in most places, transit's not even controlled by the city. But the drive for a better transit network is so strong in the center city that took most of the focus during the public outreach process. And I think that the drive for all of these, again, as Beth kind of alluded to, this is not just a climate interest, right? There's a large and increasing recognition in Minnesota and communities around the state, as there is elsewhere, of what transit and biking and walking investments and a transit, biking, and walking-based transportation system can do for folks. From an equity perspective, we have the transit system in the Twin Cities, disproportionately people of color, essential workers, lower income community members, and so improving our transit right now improves lives and opportunities for those folks right now. Builds community instead of everyone being in separate boxes on the highway all day. Allows people to interact with their community members, and then of course brings costs on the personal level down. Beth touched a bit on kind of the community level costs of sprawl investment. And of course, on a personal level, we know that the cost of a personal automobile runs about $9,000, where a transit pass costs about $1,300 a year. So that's a lot of money to spend on all those other kinds of opportunities, whether it's education, family, the things that people care about. So we move on to the next slide. We also came with kind of a summary set of recommendations in the case study report as well, which reflect, again, what we just discussed here, which is updating the climate targets on a statewide level to set bold targets for both climate reduction and VMT reduction, to stop expanding that highway capacity and investing in fast and reliable transit. Again, this plays up into the federal formulas that Beth mentioned, and then into how highway funding is distributed within the state of Minnesota as opposed to transit funding. Incentivizing development in center cities rather than exurbs, and really incentivizing and allowing development. There is a drive to develop in the center cities and first-ring suburbs. And then continuing to invest in walkable and bikeable downtowns across the state. So with that, I will wrap up and I think turn it back to Steve or Beth or someone.
Yeah, I'll take it back. So thank you, Sam. Thank you, Beth. And thank you, Beth, for reminding us all for the generosity of the McKnight Foundation once again that helps support this work. Wonderful people there. So we've got a bunch of great questions come in, probably more than we're going to be able to get to. So if Beth and Sam, if you want to try to be as pithy as you can as we walk through these, I definitely have a dozen or so that we might try to get through, and we've got 20 minutes left here. So a couple right off the bat for Beth that I wanted to throw to you is just a kind of basic one that we try to explain a little bit in the report visually, but just talk about a little bit about how safe street design does encourage more short trips, how that becomes possible when streets are safer for people walking, biking, rolling, however they choose to get around.
Yeah, and it's funny, Steve and I were just having a conversation earlier today with some of the rest of our team about showing this to people more rather than just talking about it, with some pictures and explaining how the environment around you will impact your behavior. Human beings are really well attuned to the design cues around them, and if it says danger, stay away, we pick it up real fast. So just one thing is traffic speeds. Unless you have a lot of blockage between you and high-speed traffic movement, people don't like spending time next to cars going by so fast that the air disturbance can push you over, which is the case in some places. I remember being in a car with another colleague, Rayla, who's listening in the background, in Tampa, Florida, pulling into a left turn lane and having our car shaken by the traffic going by on a road marked 45, but clearly designed to accommodate speeds of 55 or 60. No one wants to walk by that. So traffic speeds, how long do you have to walk before you can cross safely, where there's a place for you to cross? If it's a half mile, which is the case in many places, that's a long way to walk, especially if you're gonna have to walk a long way back to get to your destination just across the street. How wide is that roadway? Especially if you're pushing a stroller, or you're carrying something heavy, or you're holding the hands of a young child, or you might be a little mobility impaired. Just getting across that roadway is a struggle. And if it's 6 or 8 lanes, that looks too intimidating. So those are 3 things right off the top of my head, and there's probably 20 others, but it gives you a sense of just some basic premises of the roadway dictating whether or not someone will walk on it.
That's great. A couple questions I'm going to lump in together that are on the same topic here, and this might be for Beth or for both of you. I've got another one coming for you in a second, Sam. But Sue Wolling asked about transportation planners having the knowledge and skills to measure and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It seems like this would be something that would be new and would be difficult for them. And along these same lines, Rob Zako, our friend out in Oregon, as well, asked a question about the MPO making climate change a stated goal in their regional transportation plan. A lot of metropolitan planning organizations may be uncomfortable doing this, and there's people there trying to push the MPO to realize that it's not just the responsibility of cities and counties to reduce emissions from transportation, but also the MPO. So how can you help encourage the metropolitan planning organizations to take a role in coordinating and helping with land use? And also, how can those local planners start learning how to measure greenhouse gas emissions from transportation and start to reduce them?
Well, I will say that if you'd asked me this question 20 years ago, I'd say they don't. No one has the tools. And in fact, because of the time that my colleagues and folks in this area of smart growth and multimodal transportation ran into repeatedly, when we go talk to not just planners, but particularly engineers trying to do exactly what we were asking, they would say, we don't know how to measure this. I know it when I see it, but I can't measure it. And particularly if you're an engineer, you have to design a road to something. Yeah, you have to have a number. It can't just be this thing that feels good when I get there. So we've actually worked with some folks at Virginia DOT, but also some folks at the University of Wisconsin, the Renaissance Planning Group, some private companies like Conveyall, and a team called Sugar Access, to develop a tool that allows you to do just this. It is able to very, very quickly run millions of potential trips from a particular area and figure out how a change in the transportation system will impact mode shift by dealing with access to different modes other than just cars. But also how that will impact greenhouse gas emissions. So one is teaching our planners and our engineers to use a tool that was developed more recently than 70 years ago, or the 4-step model, which was developed more like 90 years ago, and utilizing those modern tools to answer modern questions. And if anyone has any questions about this notion of using GIS to measure true access by all modes, I can send some folks information, and reaching out to us, we can get you some as well. Oh, let me just answer the question about MPOs. Look, there's many different problems here. One is even the MPOs that want to do this aren't recognizing the tools available. Two is governors in states that claim to be climate champions aren't measuring it themselves. If they did, they could bring their MPOs the same data and the same goal down from the state, but the so-called climate champions are not focusing on this at all. And so starting with them is not a bad idea. And the other thing is there's a possibility that the feds may just tell people it's time to measure it and at least be honest with people about the lack of focus on this area that you are taking.
That's great.
I'll jump in really quickly on the
go ahead, Sam.
On the MPO piece. The MPO piece too as well. You know, I mean, one thing that I think has been somewhat effective is thinking about how thinking about those intersectional benefits of co-benefits of climate change, right? I mean, MPOs are looking at stormwater, they're looking at health impacts and so forth, and of course, climate has a lot of impacts on our natural systems, on health, on economic competitiveness and so forth. And so being able to draw those connections is important as well.
Yeah, Sam, I want to follow up with another question from Bill Pugh, who asked, what scale of per capita VMT reduction is really needed by 2030 and 2050? And I want to know, I mean, this is obviously different from place to place, depending on how much, driving there is that goes on. I think we talk a little bit about California's targets for this number within driving down emissions, but is there a number that you guys have looked into in Minnesota? And maybe if Beth wants to follow up and talk about what, where rough targets are for how much do we actually need to reduce per capita VMT to hit, 2030 and 2050 targets for emissions?
Yeah, so Minnesota does not have their own analysis of this. The best guess we have is looking at two peers, right? And so California, as you noted, has a 15% statewide reduction by 2050. Delaware has a 20% reduction by 2050, and Minnesota is looking at Delaware as a comparison. I think one of the really important pieces to think about here is that when you're looking at a state number, the distribution of who is going to be able to reduce their VMT is not equal, right? So a 20% VMT reduction in the state of Minnesota squares pretty well with what the center cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, have determined they need to reduce VMT. So that, as I said earlier, St. Paul has put a 50% VMT reduction target by 2050. Minneapolis, a 38% reduction target. Minneapolis has lighter emissions reduction targets overall. Needs to amp them up. But if you think about a 50% VMT reduction in the center cities and first-ring suburbs, then a 7% or so reduction in other parts of the state by 2050, then you hit about a 20% reduction based on our kind of population distribution. So it's really important to think about, there are places in the state where folks cannot reduce VMT. I mean, if you're living in a rural area, working on a farm, you're in a farm community, there's only so much you can do. So that's kind of our best guess. And there's actually a preliminary recommendation presentation to MnDOT tomorrow from the VMT group. So that's what's coming forward.
I will add, in terms of rural areas, I think Sam did a great job of referring to those areas where reducing greenhouse gas emissions or travel or through travel is hard as farm community, because rural America has beautiful towns, and you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by just putting everything people need in towns, which is why they were created in the first place. Because when they were first created, people didn't all have one vehicle per person over 16 years of age, and they had to cluster their trips. We can do that for rural America again. We don't have to force them to go to different towns all the time for different things and spread out their trips. We just have chosen to, and to disinvest from those rural small towns, which has been truly devastating them. Having lived for a while in my childhood in one of them in rural West Virginia, Ravenswood, which was, at its peak was 5,000 people and has dropped to about 1,200. Investment in those communities would be a good thing. But in terms of overall greenhouse gas targets, it is going to depend on the state. Some states are starting from a much better baseline, Minnesota included. Minneapolis itself has put a ton of energy over the last couple of decades in providing people with ways to reach the things they need, whether they have a car or not. Other states have not as much, or other states have other challenges. So, you know, an area like Atlanta, that about half of their emissions come from transportation, they're going to have a bigger target.
That's great. We spent a lot of time with this in preparing for this report. We had a few people ask the same question. This is a perpetual struggle, is how do we get elected leaders at all levels to understand that building more roads is not a workable solution to reducing traffic congestion? And to the person that comes up with an answer, we will give you a great big prize. But this is something we've talked about, but let's ask our panelists, you know, what they think is the way forward on this.
So I do have a couple answers to it, and you can see these answers in our own actions as a group. We released the Congestion Con earlier in 2020, which shows that everybody, no matter how much they built in terms of highways, had a massive increase in traffic congestion. In fact, there are communities that built 2.5 times as much highway as population growth, and they had the biggest increase in congestion. I can't imagine more evidence of the outcome you will get from more highway building than the fact that every single one of the largest 100 metropolitan areas in the country have seen massive increases in traffic congestion, including those that lost population and built more highway. I would challenge someone to prove to me that the reverse is true. So that is a resource I highly encourage people to use. Slightly self-serving. Go look at our great report. Praise us more. But the other thing I would say is a strategy we took on at the beginning of, or I guess about a year ago, which is to say our approach to transportation is not working. We are not starting from the position of arguing for more funding for a system that continues to do bad things in terms of quality of life, household transportation expenses, equity, climate, cost to local governments and taxpayers. We oppose it. And I think one mistake we've made as a movement is to prop up the current system, hoping that by propping it up, someone might listen to us. That has failed since I started in my career in the 90s. It's time to learn from that. And people will pay a lot more attention to us if we say, no, we're not there to back you when you come up with more money for transportation until you make it better. And that gets their attention faster than anything else. If you say, I support you, I'll do anything to support you, by the way, would you please listen to these demands I have, they're going to think, I need to go listen to people yelling at me. But if you say, I'm not there for you, this system is rotten and it has to get better, and then if you listen to me, I might support you coming up with more money for this program, something hard for policymakers to do, they will pay much closer attention.
Amen to that second point. I think that's a fantastic point. And I'll add one other thing, which is that we have used some examples of the inverse, which is examples where capacity has gone away and congestion has not increased. Some famous ones around the country, from the Embarcadero Freeway falling and traffic just disappearing. We had an example of that in the Twin Cities as well, where we've got our bridge across the Mississippi. Most of the traffic capacity was taken off to make way for our light rail line, and traffic just disappeared. And 18,000 trips a day appears to not have actually gone anywhere else. But I think the most important tool is persistence.
Yes, that's a really good point. And I will say, Sam makes another great point. Our models just can't do what we need them to do. It's not their fault. We didn't design them to answer these questions. They can't measure the trip not taken. Just they can't. That's not what they were built to do. And they can't determine that a trip would go away. It's beyond them. We never asked them to do it. So they always assume that everything you do will involve a trip. as if none of us receive deliveries, as if none of us use Amazon, as if none of us get our groceries brought to our home. The models can't handle that. So we just have to recognize that the tools we've been given to make decisions are not very good, and stop trusting them as if they're the gospel truth.
We had a few questions related to COVID and related to sort of the perception, which maybe even we shared early on, that COVID is forcing an exodus from the cities. We've been having this conversation in the chat a little bit already, noting the data from Zillow that they've put out a couple times this year, just for the most part noting that's not really true. It's not actually taking place within the cities when it comes to home sales and all those sorts of things. We had some questions about, so maybe let's talk about the housing piece a little bit. John Rath asked, notes that many reports say that home buyers are more and more seeking walkable pedestrian communities. We've done some of that research here at Smart Growth America. How big of an influence is that in reducing transportation miles? And why are we not able to to meet that demand if this is if there is a preference for this? And maybe we could talk about this at a big picture level, and Sam can even talk about what they've seen in the Twin Cities perhaps, and how they've tried to address some of that.
Yeah, these are such important questions, and they're huge. In terms of why we haven't been able to meet demand, it's because for the most part it's illegal to do so. It requires exceptions to the law to be able to build what the market demands. Government regulation prohibits people from getting what they want through land use codes that say you can't put the things you need close to you, or roadway design that makes it, that demands that you prioritize the vehicle. It's written into the rules, and engineers that want to get out of that, there's a process, it's called the exceptions process. It takes 18 to 24 months, and then they are punished for blowing their schedule and their budget. So the system is designed not to give people what they want, which is why there's such price pressures when they actually exist. When you artificially bring down the supply as the demand goes up, the price is automatically going to go through the roof. And so deregulating land use and transportation is a great way to get to both less greenhouse gas emissions, fewer greenhouse gas emissions, and addressing some of those price pressures. But in terms of COVID, which is a great question, it's interesting. You'll see the same report side by side. People are abandoning the cities. Price of houses in the cities still going up, up, up. Someone didn't take macroeconomics, if that is true. If the demand for city homes has gone way down, the price pressures would come off. They're not, and what people are doing is misinterpreting some of the data. They're seeing that people stopped looking for housing at the beginning of the pandemic. What they don't notice is then when things eased up a bit, the demand for everything went through the roof. What they also don't seem to distinguish is between New York City and San Francisco and the rest of the country. I would argue that there's not one person except for those in those two cities that identify with the housing situation and the cost of living in those two cities. So it's interesting that we're applying their experiences universally to the country. New York and San Francisco are seeing people, due to price pressures, move to outside locations. We're not seeing the same impact on others, but I will just finish up by saying this. Anyone who tells you nothing will change because of COVID should be disregarded out of hand. Anyone who tells you everything will change because of COVID should equally get disregarded. And anyone who says they know for sure how things will change should be disregarded. I think we should just pay attention and recognize we're not even quite in the middle of this, and watch what happens before we make conclusive decisions that we have no right to make.
Yeah, I think from the Minneapolis perspective, I would echo a lot of what Beth said. We've, my other identity is president of Minneapolis Planning Commission. And so we've seen and pushed forward a lot of policies to expand or to really to deregulate the housing regulation zoning code by allowing up to 3 units, residential units on any lot in the city. Which seems like such a small thing, and of course got a lot of national attention because it is what people want. the questioner said, why aren't we doing this if this is what people want? It's what people want kind of on a macro level, and it's not exactly what people want if it's on their block, right? There's a thought of my parking space is going to go away, which, it's not your parking space, it's on-street parking, it's not yours. And there's a thought of, I want to have a cafe to walk to, but also want to keep my own block exactly the same. Of course, those aren't possible, right? If you want to have a cafe to walk to, you want to have a grocery store nearby, there's got to be a market for the grocery store, market for the cafe, et cetera. And so Minneapolis, through really strong elected leadership and bold elected leadership, was able to move this plan forward. And there was a kind of progressive city council voted in the midst of our comprehensive planning process, which I think it really juiced the ability of the city council to move this forward. And, anecdotally, as a planning commissioner, and we have some of the numbers in, we saw a dip in some activity in terms of our regular planning commission hearings in terms of approvals, but it's kind of back up, and we've got PAC hearings, and development is moving forward quickly. So there is still a fair amount of development happening during COVID, and there are ongoing conversations at the city level within the Department of Transportation and so forth. This is all very like Minneapolis specific here, or Public Works Department on carving out more of that street space, trying to hold that street space so that people have places to gather. That understanding of public gathering spaces as an important piece that's come out of COVID as well.
Great, and we're just a couple minutes over time, so we're gonna wrap this up here. I wanna give a big thank you to Sam from Move Minnesota. Thank you to Beth from our Transportation for America program as well. Big thank you to the McKnight Foundation for helping to support this work. Thank you everyone for the tremendous questions we got. We got way more than we could ever possibly answer. Some really great things. I do wanna note, a lot of people are interested in seeing the accessibility analysis and getting their hands on being able to do some of that. As soon as Beth talked about that, 10 people popped up and saying, I would love to see that. So if you signed up for this, we'll be able to email you and send you some things, hopefully maybe answer some questions in an email as well. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Download the report, let us know if you have questions, and we appreciate everyone being here today. Hope you all have a great week.